Hello, everyone. Welcome to Achieving Success with Olivia Akin. I am your host, Olivia Akin. Each week, we will discuss the roadmap of achieving your personal and professional success. We give you real life stories on growing personally and professionally to achieve your life and career goals with the help of some top-notch guests. Today, we are speaking with Susan Pence. Susan is an assistant principal at Legacy Traditional Schools. She has been in the education area teaching both elementary and high school students for 20 years. In her current role, Susan has taken her many years of experience teaching students with a wide range of learning needs to make the educational experience the best it could be for educators and for students. You can find Susan on LinkedIn by searching Susan Pence. Hello, Susan. It's fantastic having you on the show today.
Hi, Olivia. Thanks for having me on.
I am so excited to dive into your journey and the education environment in general, because I think there's so many things we can all learn from that areas. But before we dive into it, I want to start off by asking you, what does success mean and look like to Susan Pence?
That's a loaded question. I mean, it's you look at it through so many different lenses. I think like professionally and personally, um, I do put a lot into my professional life, and in my current role as an administrator, as a assistant principal, like you wear so many different hats, and it's incredible. Like you want to make sure that you're there for the teachers, you want to make sure you're there for the parents, you want to make sure that you're there for the kids, and making sure that you are promoting community, above all, teaching people to be critical thinkers, reinforcing that, but also just being there. And I think that some of the hardest part is like learning how to be a part of a community, but like how to give and how to receive, like all the parts of a community. And I think like that's really what I've turned my focus to the past couple of years. I mean, especially post pandemic, we're looking at education. We have to very differently now. I don't think we don't know what the fallout was. I mean, for lack of a better word, and maybe we're looking at that, and me using the term fallout might even be incorrect too, because maybe it's the revolution we need also within the education world.
And I think it's something that through a lot of ups and downs and the unknown, a lot can be seen and we can have a very different perspective. One of those things as well that I think COVID really shined a light on is the burnout within the education environment. And we're seeing a lot more and really hearing a lot more about the burnout that is happening with educators now. And a lot of the work that a lot of people might not have previously realized what that goes into teaching and what happens if you have to call out and all these things that you have to prep and be prepared to show up and deliver in the needs of students. So why do you think we're hearing more and more educators end their career not have it last as long due to burnout, where in the past we didn't hear about it as much, as well as how do you keep going every day when you start to feel like you're burning out?
Uh, these are, again, great questions. I think that the workload has always been there. So when I started my career over 20 years ago, it's hilarious to hear it. I know it, I feel it, but I remember my first year of teaching, my entire weekend was dedicated to planning lessons. And so I taught history. So I was a history major in college, but history is so broad. You do world history, you can do American history, there's so much that I ended up having to teach myself something, and then plan the instruction for kids that are not all on the same level. And again, this is 20 years ago, post COVID. We didn't know much about, I mean, we knew about differentiation, whether or not we were actually differentiating, completely different story. And I remember my mom saying to me, like, I had no idea how much work it took. And I was already feeling it as a brand new teacher. I think now, especially with COVID, when kids were stuck at home, for lack of better phrasing, I think then it came really into light, like, oh my God, my kid's teacher is not just there delivering a lesson. They're taking care of all of their needs. You know what I'm saying? Like, one of the things, like, and I talked to about it with my husband based on his background, and I know you know about him too. It's like we talk a lot about behavior because I deal with a lot of behavior, and all behavior is a form of communication. So trying to find out, like, sometimes I do feel like a translator because of like what is happening right now, and looking at it as what is my highest, leverage right now, how we can get kids back into the classroom, get them ready to learn, because the point of them being in school is primarily for instruction, but the role of school has taken on so much more than I think that people, realize. Because that is kind of that centerpiece. It's kind of that, and I go back to that word community, and like learning how to work with everyone in this building. Like it is so much more than a school. It's such a foundation to a community.
And just for our listeners who might have not caught what Susan is saying here, so her husband is Richard, who was a yes, who was a previous guest on our show and is a former police officer. And his episode is amazing, and you should go check it out. So there's a tidbit to her husband, but also Susan's off to a great start. So keep listening because she is at the same level, if not doing better. Don't tell Richard that, right? As we're starting this off. But I think there's such a piece here when you say talking with your husband because of the background that he has as a police officer, where communicating and behavior really plays a role because you're seeing it at a much younger age where things can be really shaped. I always tell people that once you hit your late 20s, early 30s, do not expect your partner, let's say it's a boyfriend, girlfriend, friend that you meet, and you don't like 10 traits of theirs, and you're like, well, being friends, I'll change it. Being with my boyfriend, I'll change it. No, you're not going to be able to change it. So if you really don't like those things about that individual at that point in their life, you cannot, most of the time, cannot reshape their behavior. Shaping behavior and shaping communication really happens during that developmental stage where you're seeing it as your role every single day.
And I would like to say, like, it's actually one of my favorite parts about being in my position, because I do have that opportunity to work with kids on a different level. They know that they can come talk to me, which is great too, because they do need that outlet. And I think like I think that also comes down to the burnout, because then I go home and I worry about it. Did I handle it correctly? Am I making sure that I have all that information to make sure that I'm getting them the support that they need, or for them to just understand that they're listening? So we do try with kids sometimes to say, like, is it that you need to tell me, or do you want some advice? And like a couple times too, like talking about friends, and then it trickles onto social media, and that's the other part, that they're really having trouble discerning, like, what is reality and what are people actually presenting to them. And I think then it kind of goes back to that's that cool piece about school, is that we're always trying to get them to be critical thinkers. And I think sometimes when we hear the behaviors that are happening in school, like they're defiant, they're and so talking about what is defiance, well, they refuse to do it. And it's like, it's funny because it's a double-edged sword sometimes, because we are teaching them to be critical thinkers, and we do tell them, and we're trying to get them to that point where they're challenging what they're either being told, what they're reading about. And so sometimes it's our own fault. Now there's tone, and there's so many other things that come into it, but it is kind of cool to see them not, I don't want to see push back, but when they're challenging the thinking, right? Not, and there's ways to do it. And I think that's the whole part of it, especially with dealing with middle schoolers, is that they're coming into it and they're learning to think through things. to see them actually use what they're learning, and not just in a content sense, but they're kind of pushing back against the world, which is that's where like great revolutionaries start. I taught history for a long time, and it comes from challenging what has already been established. So
For you, how's it seeing students who might not be engaging? Because, like you've mentioned a few times today, and I can 100% agree from an educator standpoint, because I've been an educator myself. Not all students perceive information the same way. Not all students uh, will be able to learn the same way, test the same way, or even on the same levels when you come into a classroom that could be standard across the board, and you have to teach the same content. So for you, as both someone who's been the educator, but now as the assistant principal, and being able to see things from two different perspectives, how do you try to help students who are on different tracks who have to learn the same content?
I mean, and I think that's really the hard part too. I've been in a very fortunate experience, and I think too that just having done this for so long, that I don't know if, and I used to tell my students this too when I was in the classroom, like, I'm not really sure if I care you know all the ins and outs to the Battle of Waterloo, right, with Napoleon. And I'm like, I'm not sure if I care that you know all the minutia parts. I want you to be able to read it, interpret it for yourself, and then use it for whatever argument you need to do. So really, I think for the kids, it's like, yes, we are content specific in a school, but I think that really talking about critical thinking skills and how for them to think about things in a broader sense and then apply it. One of my favorite situations, I think my last year of teaching eighth grade social studies, I the kids will tell you that I go off on a tangent. I think though the ones that were a little bit more higher level would realize my point behind everything. Like I brought up it was an article I read about Costco and how they're never going to change the price of their rotisserie chicken, and like where they put things in the store. Because we were talking about economics. So I brought up Costco. And, we talked about it. I'm like, you're never going to go to Costco and just get a rotisserie chicken. I guarantee it. And they're like, what? I can do it. So they were all challenging me, that we can go in and just get a Costco chicken. But I said, but why am I bringing this up? And they're like, well, you have to walk through the store. Then you're going to realize you need 10 pounds of jelly beans, even though you don't really like jelly beans, but there might be an issue where you need and they start talking about that. And then they're like, but does gas count too? Because the gas is really. So I think trying to think outside the box and get kids on a level. So like Costco is one of those things where kids know about it, right? And they all have some sort of experience with Costco. And so trying to like make it a little bit more universal, because you have in your class kids that have specific learning disabilities, or English is not their first language, but they're going to know what Costco is. So it's like really trying to find those universal things that kids are going to be able to grasp on some level. Now, it's a shame what we do in this country with we give standardized tests, but we're expected to differentiate all the content. So if we're expected to differentiate everything, why are we standardizing what they're expected to know? It doesn't make sense. I also don't know what the solution is, so I really want to be upfront about that. I don't know what the answer is, and I understand like we need to have some sort of you know level at which we assess people, but I think we could be doing better. Again, not sure what that looks like. I do worry about kids and reading, for example, as well, like critical thinking and kids not liking to read too. I think that's the hard part for me.
And another thing that we're seeing, or I have seen with individuals who are different levels, there's some times, especially in those elementary, middle school, high school environments, where it's not just that feeling of they're being left out or they're not at the same path of everyone else, but pressure by the school district, by the state for teachers to go, okay, no, they are at that level. They're going to go up that grade, or these test scores are where it should be. So when you bring up the test scores, my other question is for you, how do you try to leave some of that pressure sometimes when there can be so much pressure from even the outside, not necessarily parents, but communities on hitting certain benchmarks or just kind of, and I hate to put it this way, pushing a student along so that looks better on paper?
I mean, and that's the other thing. And I think it kind of goes back to what I was saying. We're standardizing things, but we're expected to differentiate. Like we recognize that not all kids are learning at the same level, right? Which is fantastic because how boring would that be? I always like the kids that kind of um I always like the kids that push back and whether or not it's a behavior. So I say that I like the kids that push back. Let me rephrase. I like them eventually, right? Because you want those kids that you're going to have to try harder for because you're going to have to figure out how to win, not win them over, but like figure them out. And it takes a little bit longer, but that reward is always going to be greater. The thing is, the reward with that situation is you're not going to necessarily see that on test grades. You're going to see that as that kid had a positive interactions in school. I have a student, Roxette. She's in her late 20s. She's come out to visit my husband and I, and smart girl, like loved the Cuban Missile Crisis and Justin Bieber. Not, those are the things that I remember her as being as 16. So smart. Like it didn't matter. I could have just had her read worksheets all day. She would have gotten it. She was smart. Um, but I said to her a couple of years ago, she came out to visit us, and I'm like, why would you reach out to me, right? And like she was in Vegas for a week, went to Vegas, was like, can I come like pop over for, like hopped on a flight. I'm like, who does this? But I'm also like, I was in Vegas for a week, but but she came out and I'm driving her back and I'm like, why did you come out here? Just out of curiosity. I'm like, I'm so glad you did. But she goes, you were my safe place in school. And like things I don't know what I did, but I guess I did them. Like, and I know she loved Justin Bieber. We laughed about it. She worked him into like I said, the Cuban Missile Crisis. I'm not sure how she made the connection, but it was hilarious. And the whole class got it, like because she did what I tried to do. Um, but I think also like we deal with a lot of kids that come to school that already have had negative experiences in school. Their parents have also had negative experiences in school, and it doesn't necessarily correlate to the best learning environment. The other issue is like kids know they have to go to school. That's it. There's never really an option for it. And I think that's hard too. Like I know I respect education much more as an adult because I get to choose what am I going to do? What am I going to take? What next? What else can I do? And I think like that's kind of the other hard part is that we don't give them a lot of autonomy with things, right? So they're forced into things that are sometimes just hard or they're not engaged in it or there's just so many things that I think like I understand the big picture of it and I understand the education. I taught history for a long time, so I know why things evolved, and I'm that type of person that I need to know the why before I can buy into it. And I think that that's just um, some of the things that are really hard for us this like now, especially as educators.
And that being said, I want to touch upon the educator side of things because we can all have bad days and we all have things that shape who we are and how we can perceive different situations. And it can be really hard, for example, when you're a teacher trying to keep an eye, whether it's kindergarten to a college professor, because let me tell you, I was a college professor, and handling 20 students and making sure they're doing the task I've assigned instead of just checking, their Facebook page can be just as hard and trying to rail them in as that kindergarten teacher, right? But for you, as you've seen and work with teachers who are in the thick of it day to day and are having to either reprimand a student based on only knowing a piece of information, or they're getting frustrated about certain situations that because they're in the middle of it, they don't necessarily know how to proceed forward or get everyone back on track. How do you handle those situations and work with educators when they start to feel that way?
It's hard, and you especially see it now. We're on spring break right now, so you always see an uptick in things right before a break because everybody's exhausted. And I think sometimes too with kids, it their behavior looks like they don't want to be here, but they're actually afraid for being off for a certain amount of time too. So they're looking to get as much attention as possible. It's a very weird way to act, but that is really what it comes down to. I think for a lot of teachers, understanding that with sometimes the kids, they both need a break from each other. So making sure that I'm trying to figure out those things. Um, and making sure that I'm talking to both sides of the situation, right? Like I do talk to the kid and like, tell me what happened, you know, and then talk to the teacher as well. And then really I do try and include the parent because if there's some information that we're missing, it's going to change the way everybody responds to one another too. So like kind of going back to that community piece, like you call home and you find out, the grandparent is dying or parents are separating and there's a lot that they're dealing with at that particular moment. And the thing is, especially with like middle schoolers or just the upper elementary kids, is that they're dealing with a lot of emotion at once that their brains are not, I mean, their brains are still developing. And so, it used to be what, 23, your brain was formally developed. Now they're saying 25. So like, I just don't think we know enough yet. But I remember me being that age and I hated middle school. And I always say this to the kids. I'm like, let me tell you, no one wakes up and decides they want to be a middle school assistant principal. I'm like, no one. There's no way. Even like middle school teacher, I remember when I was subbing, like got a long time ago, and I refused to get up for seventh grade science. Like I told my mom would be like, you need the money. And I'm like, nope, don't need the money. It's a special time of in age and just I like to get as much information as possible to go back to your initial point is like going back and trying to figure things out because the thing is we don't have the luxury of like getting rid of things. Like we either have to figure it out and work through it or it's going to be a mess because we don't have a lot of other options. And and as I say to the kid, I'm like, this is going to happen. And I think the hard part too for the age that we deal with is that sometimes you're just going to be disappointed. And that's I think a hard lesson, right? Is that sometimes people make mistakes, sometimes they're not their best. And the thing is we're all human. And I know that like that was a hard lesson for me. And just, trying to really reconcile those things and not be disappointed by the adults in your life too, but being like, all right, we're going to try and figure all of this out together.
And I think that's something that I think is so important. And I've heard you say this in stories you've told, and really what you're expressing so far is the importance of communication and knowing that we might not all have a choice at that moment in time, but it's pushing through and figuring it out because sometimes we don't have that choice. We have to just push through and kind of shape how it's going to be as we're moving through it.
I have one kid that it's really funny because I'm like, one day I just said to him, I'm like, nothing good ever happens on Tuesday. I know today's Tuesday, but and like so he'll walk past me today and he's like, "How are you?" And I'm like, "Well," he goes, "It is Tuesday, Miss Pence." And I'm like, "All right, so I'm just gonna wait it out." And I think too that is sometimes it's like sometimes all we can do is just try again the next day. And I think like that is a lot of life too, is just showing up and trying again. Like there's really no, I don't think there's a secret recipe for things. And I think that it is just getting up and trying it again and trying it a little bit differently from the day before.
For you as well, when you, because you have the different perspectives as a teacher, as a assistant principal, as dealing with kids at different points in their lives and having that different environment, when you're approaching a student who might need that extra help, or they've just come up from elementary school to middle school and there's certain things they need in place to help them excel, how do you try to express, have that conversation with parents, have that conversation on the other side with the educators to really make sure everyone's on the same page and that everyone's being heard and advocating for that student as well?
Yeah, and those are definitely very tricky situations because you always want what's best for the kid. Um, but sometimes like the behaviors are just undeniable at that point. And just saying, luckily, I think when it gets to that point, I've already built up that relationship with parents, with the kid, with the other educators that, hey, we did this, we did this, we did this. This is not working right now. Let's try it. What more can we do at this point? Because I think that that's like nobody ever wants to give up on someone. Um, I think that when you're older, yes, kind of what you were talking about, when they're in their 20s and their 30s trying to change it. A kid's a very different situation, right? Because there's got to be something else that we can try. And sometimes it's this is the like the great thing about Arizona, and like there's so many different types of schools too, that perhaps this one just isn't the right fit sometimes too. And not that you ever want to say that to the parent, take your kid somewhere else. That's not solving anything. But like I think that we have to really try something different, and sometimes it's about thinking outside the box. And that's really hard too, because then you get people saying, well, why is so and so getting this? And it's not about equality, it's about equity, is that everybody is getting what they need, and it's not going to look equal, right? Like everybody's going to get a pair of shoes, but not all the shoes are going to be the same.
Mhm. I love that. And I think it's so true. And I think sometimes too, things can develop when you're that age where, for example, I'll use my own experiences. When I was in kindergarten or even preschool, up until when I was 9 years old, I was that high performer. I mean, granted, I will admit I'm still a high performer, but like that didn't need a lot of help in school. I'd get the information, I'd move forward. But at 9 years old, I was diagnosed with epilepsy. So now the aid I needed in the classroom was vastly different. Communicating with, I remember my parents going in and having conversations with the principal, assistant principal, like a team of individuals who were trying to now, I don't want to say it this way, but problem solve on how to really make sure I was getting the help I needed, that it would communicate from, third grade to my fourth grade teacher to my fifth grade, and having that consistency while also providing me the resources I needed to grow, while also keeping everyone else, including my parents, on the same page with how things were progressing. And
Yeah.
so I think that's really important sometimes. And there's situations where like that where it's not behavioral. There's no outside pull, for example, parent life or the community you're in that can change or alter what's going on. Sometimes you have to just move and groove with the flow when you're handed a situation as well.
Yeah, and it's about like navigating what would like a new normal, right? And we don't always get like a guidebook for that either. And I'm sure in your situation, they were like, what does she need an aid for? She's not a behavioral kid, she's not behavioral. We're not seeing this. Um, but then it's also like you have a child's privacy to maintain, like, and not just a child, it's anybody's privacy where it's like, it's just going to look different. And I think that's the hard part is that it's not about equality, it's about equity. And it's very different. It's a couple of different letters, but it's a very different meaning. Like we have to give kids what they need, and not everybody is going to require the same thing. And not at the same time. Sometimes, yes, everybody can get the same thing and it's fine. And then no. And then it's, it's different than, a few minutes later. And like that is what it is sometimes.
And and I love how you brought up the aid aspect because this is something I also remember from time I was diagnosed up until I graduated really high school. There was always a second individual, that special education teacher in the room. I was in elementary and having seizures regularly, it was a one-on-one. Like they were there sitting next to me as the teacher taught, and like that's what it looked like. When I stopped having seizures and went to middle school, there was a second special education teacher who was in the room, and there might be some other individuals in that classroom who had things for certain that needed that second individual as well, where it didn't need to be one-on-one all the time, but could keep them focused, different things like that, until I went to college. And I think sometimes you said something really important that I want to hit on. It's like the example you gave of, okay, why do they need an aid? They don't have behavioral issues. Well, an aid can be shaped in many different ways. And I think that there's a big misconception sometimes, whether it's from the teacher or from a family member perspective, where there is a lack of information on why, having an aid in the classroom can be super beneficial to not just the student, but helping the educator, or why having that student leave their classroom for 20, 30 minutes to go have speech therapy or to go for any of the numerous things that can also be offered in a classroom at that age can be so beneficial long term.
Yeah, and even when I taught high school, like I co-taught with my goodness, this is going back like maybe 15 years. I co-taught with an ELL teacher, but also then I also co-taught SPED. And I was in the middle of doing or the end of my first master's in curriculum and instruction. And I polled the kids and I'm like, why do you think there's two teachers in here? They didn't know. Like they really couldn't tell. And I think like that, like kind of what you were talking about is like, we look at it the wrong way, I think. And, I kind of just said to the kids, because they were like, well, why do we? And I'm like, aren't you lucky to have two people that want to be in the same classroom working with you guys? And they're like, oh, you know what I mean? Like it hadn't clicked for them on that. And like in theory, I was the content specialist and they were more of like the language acquisition. Um, but I mean, I learned so much just from like the language acquisition, and it was better than me like paying for grad school because I'm like, oh, I never would have thought to like introduce the lesson like that, not at the high school level, but that's what the kids needed. So it's just, it was like a great opportunity. And while they're like discussing like specifically how it was instructionally, I just like lumped it up. It's good instruction. Like that's it. It's not necessarily, yes, all kids need language acquisition, whether or not they are English born, learners or they're not. Like it was good instruction. That's it. It was pretty phenomenal when I went through it.
Now looking at that experience as well and having the conversation sometimes with the teacher or with a parent saying, hey, I think we need to put some of these things in place to help your child grow, like that aid in the classroom. or sending them, for 30 minutes once a week, whatever it might be, to that speech teacher who's down the hall. How do you kind of gauge those conversations, especially when that's someone's kid and they might not be looking at it that same way, especially when there's been a lot of negative connotation in the past around that within the education environment?
I think that it's now changing from what I've seen. It's really changing. So like at my first job, like 20 years ago, I remember um, I was teaching a smaller group of students that it would have been considered like a sheltered special ed class. And there was one girl in there, she wasn't special ed, but she was EL. So they just didn't know what to do with her. So it was, you know what I mean? It was more language acquisition. I think fast forward 20 years, we've really come a long way in all of those things. I also think that parents recognize that something is a little bit, and I don't want to say different, because like when we also look at, and I think this is the other thing to kind of think through too, is that when kids are, labeled as special education or ESS, like exceptional student services, or they require exceptional student services, it's not meant to be a life sentence either. And it's not something, it's supposed to be something where they end up graduating from. And that's always exciting when you do see a kid that finally is, able to move past those additional supports. So I think it kind of goes back to that whole equity thing, is that we need to give kids what they need at that time. And it's not meant to be a life, like I said, a life sentence. It's meant to give them what they need so that they can be successful amongst their peers.
And that brought up a memory for me. And I think this is also important to share is that I was friends with this girl. Her name was Jordan growing up, and she was really nice. And then we went to middle school, and she lives down the street from me. And we kind of grew distance once I was diagnosed with epilepsy, because we're talking 20 years ago too. So even the information now is a lot weaker. Try having not just going through it yourself as a kid and your parents and like the community trying to gauge and help support, but other 9-year-old kids looking back, losing your friends, you're like so sad about how do they not understand this and that. When you're a grown up, you're like, everyone was 9. There's a piece of it where you have to let go at a certain age of like the resentment of like that feelings and those experiences, because you understand a very different perspective now. When it came to Jordan, she was always nice to me, but we did get distant once I started having seizures. And then we went to do 2 different middle schools. But I'd run into her time to time. And in my town growing up, there was 13 elementary schools, 3 middle schools, 3 high schools. And depending on what side of town you lived, you went to either one of the 2 high schools. However, that third high school was a behavioral school. So for kids who really couldn't behave and needed that extra support or whatever it might be. So Jordan would have went to the same high school I went to. And I saw her for like the first 2 months of high school, and then I stopped seeing her. And fast forward like a year, and I saw her in my neighborhood, and I started talking to her, and she ended up having to go to the behavioral school. And it was at that time, the behavioral school is like, oh, it's that school. Like, you must have been a really bad kid to have to go there, because everyone used it as that thing where it was like, if you don't behave or this and that, you're going to that school. So there was this really negative connotation to it. And she was never that kid that was so bad that, needed that, in my own opinion, because I knew her as an individual. Fast forward to when I was in college, I came back and I was out running to Wawa. If anyone's in the Northeast, you know what a Wawa is. And we were out there at like 11 o'clock at night. And so coincidentally, there was an emergency that happened at the Wawa and the ambulance had to come. So we were all sequestered in this one, they needed to help an individual. So we were all kind of kept to the side to make sure no one disturbed that individual. And I ran into Jordan that night and we were talking and she was telling me about her life and this and that. And we were just talking about this behavioral school. It came up in conversation. And she goes, that was the best experience. And it taught me so much more because honestly, if I kept being in the classroom without anyone acknowledging that I needed to have that additional help, that I needed to be in an environment where the teachers were going to be a little rougher, than necessarily the teachers in the high school and really talk to me differently, um, I would have been in a very different situation at that point. And it was that moment to me where I was like, we looked at these behavioral schools or things like that in the community when someone's taken out of the school they're in or whatever it might be and put somewhere else as a negative. But realistically, they're set up to help elevate that student, to get them past, to graduate and be on the right track.
Yeah, we definitely look at things, I would say, the wrong way, like kind of just we were talking about ESS, EL. It's more of something where we need the traditional way is not working and we need to figure something else out. That's really what it comes down to. Um, Class size has a lot to do with it. Not being acknowledged. What's the point of me going if no one is going to acknowledge me? And maybe, and sometimes it does. You have to figure out how best to communicate with kids. Some kids, like, you can yell at them all day. They don't know how to respond to it. You talk to them and you say something like, I'm really disappointed in how you behaved today, and they will lose their minds. And, like, these are big kids sometimes too. That it's like it's all about learning what's best. And again, it's hard because we have these quote unquote, and for lack of a better word, traditional settings for kids. School's kind of the same model it's always been. um I don't know what kind of change is needed because the funding's not there. And I think that that's the other problem is we're not paying teachers enough. um you know um like, there's things like soft skills that I would have thought, and I kept thinking that people just had them. They don't have them anymore. And, like, how do you teach kids this? And that's something else that I think that they need to figure out too. Like, the amount of times kids walk into my office and I send them out to try it again because that is not the way they enter something, like, because we're not going to get anywhere if that's my first impression right now. So, really, like, kind of working through, there's just so much that goes into it. And sometimes, like you said, that behavioral school, it's set up for it, right? That might be the deficit. And I say deficit like it's a bad thing. I think that we just think we get all of these we've changed, like, semantics, like deficit, and saying it's a bad thing. It's just that you're just lacking in it for now. It's kind of like that growth mindset, like, I'm not doing it right now, but that doesn't mean I won't.
And I think that's really important. And I want to ask you one last question before we start to wrap up. And it was on the theme of community, which I think we've really leaned into in many different aspects today. But what would be your advice for individuals, whether it be parents, students, teachers? You can take it in any direction you want. You free range here. But how they should approach school to really then use it as that resource to build out the community.
For sure. So I'm like you, I'm from the East Coast and I loved me some Wawa at 11. It's been a minute since we've been to one, but so coming out here, Arizona is very interesting because of the way they have approached schools, public schools. Um, for parents, I would definitely say like, and this is just very eye opening for me. Do your research. Just because the school looks away or you've heard from so and so that this is a great school, it doesn't mean it's going to be the best fit for your kid. And knowing your kid, but being able to talk to the people that work there, right? Having an open dialogue with them, being a part of it, seeing where they're going and spending their time and like talking to the teachers too about, this, staying off the Facebooks where they're getting like an opportunity to kind of talk about people rather than talk to people. And I think like that's been some of the other things too, like have a conversation. Um, and I get it. Like people are busy. Like I understand that part, but like making sure that you're talking and you're learning about what's going on rather than going off of information that somebody told you or that you read about on Facebook or you heard your kids say. Um, I think that's one of those kind of the soft skills we've kind of gone away from. Um, like, but learning to make sure that you're having those conversations, especially when your kid is involved. I know that I've gotten a lot of angry parent emails, phone calls, all of that, and I get it. And a lot of times too, parents will end up, apologizing to me for how they came across, and I always tell them, I'm like, look, I'm always more concerned with a non-reaction than a reaction. I would prefer they came in at me hot, but let me preface this by saying I don't like being yelled at. um, but this is your kid. This is important. Like this should be of utmost importance to you, right? Because this is your kid. And that is where your priority should be. Um, but being involved, being part of it and seeing who do they talk to every day? Who is this? Who is the librarian that they talk about all the time? Because the librarian's in the hallway all the time having conversations and knows everybody, like that's phenomenal. Or the person that's working in the cafeteria or our head of facilities that knows every single kid and the kids beg to work with him, like those are the things that you should be investing in that it's not just the principals or the assistant principals that you want to talk to. You want to talk to everybody there because all of us are in there for the right reasons to impact your kid.
I think that's such great advice as well. Susan, how can people get in touch with you if they want to connect with you?
You can connect with me on LinkedIn.
Lovely. And thank you so much for all of your insight today, Susan. And a few of those key takeaways from today's conversation are behavior is a form of communication. Not all bad behavior. Granted, if you're going extreme bad behavior, then like that's a different conversation. But I think it's so important how Susan brought that up, that behavior is still communicating. They're showing you things that they might not be able to express through words. So keep that in mind when you're reading someone's behavior and grasping how to communicate with them, as well as ask a kid or even an adult, do you need to tell me or do you need my advice? I think that's so important for us as individuals, whether we're parents, whether we're friends, teachers. Sometimes we show up in the way we want to, right? Your friend vents to you and you're like, okay, this is how we're going to solve the problem. But then you forget that's not why they came to you. They came to you to vent. So I love how Susan brought that up. Take the time to ask a child, ask your friend, ask your partner, whoever it might be, do you need to tell me this in order to vent, or do you need my advice? So you can show up in the way that they need you to show up in that moment. And it can pivot from situation to situation, as well as it isn't always about knowing the details of everything you learn, but being able to take that information and interpret it and be able to apply it into the situation that's in front of you. And I think that is one of the things that I love that Susan brought up, and probably my most favorite, because a lot of times when it comes to education, school, testing, you feel like I have to retain this detail from detail. And then you get like 10 years out and you're like, wait, I don't use that. Why did I need to learn that? Why was there emphasis on this, right? We could all relate to that. But in reality, like Susan brought up, is about taking the time to teach you how to interpret the information, be able to apply it, and turn it and be able to leverage it for the situation that you're in. As well as sometimes all we could do is try it again the next day. And lastly, it's not always about quality, but equity. This was ultimately my favorite tidbit that Susan said today. This was a great episode with our top-notch guest, Susan Pence. Thank you for listening and have a successful day.